It's a final word with Adam Collins, and a man who, look, I say many times when introing our interviews, it's someone I've wanted to get on the show for a long time. Sometimes I'm telling the truth. Sometimes I'm not telling the truth. Well, this is the man who Jeff and I identified back in 2015 as the first person we wanted to get on the final word. It has taken 7 years for it to happen because we're incompetent, not his fault. Adam Zwar, he's written a book called 12 Summers. Being a lifelong fan of Australian cricket is harder than it looks. I'm putting it up in front of the various cameras here. Adam, thank you so much for coming on and having a chat about your wonderful book.
Thank you, Colo. Yeah, it's I've been a big fan of all your podcasts. So this is a big thing for me as well.
It's such a clever idea. So I just wanted to start with the idea behind the book. It's called 12 Summers, and it's literally that, 12 chapters that document your relationship with cricket and your life and how we timestamp our lives around the game. And that is, that's so ridiculously relatable. I mean, the smells and the sounds of the game that so much inform how we reflect upon our own journey on this planet.
Yeah, look, for me, I think I describe in the book that it's an emotional banister for me, cricket. I was a bit of an emotionally fragile kid, and seeing those people. I mean, when you were watching television and you saw Lily and Marsh and Chappell, you didn't know what was going on inside their heads. I mean, for me, that just looked like the most kind of bulletproof people you'd ever seen in your life. They would just look like people that would, rescue you from a fire, true heroes. And so I think just seeing them gave me confidence, and that was that was something that stayed with me all my life, really. I mean, cricketers, they're fascinating individuals, very eccentric, strange people, and I love them.
Yeah. Maybe that's where we'll start. I mean, we'll go through, I think, as a frame for our conversation, if we use each of the 12 set-piece moments in your life, thus the cricket. And you mentioned anxiety. I mean, that is a very strong theme of the first chapter, which is about the underarm incident. But Cairns probably wasn't an easy place to fit in if you felt like you weren't fitting in, is how I'm interpreting it. And you, from a very early age, felt like you didn't fit in, and thus cricket was a crutch, but also you sort of turned inward a little bit. And thankfully, I suppose you had parents who were very supportive and who kind of got that you needed a bit more attention than the average bear in Desmond and Delphine, and thus you kind of they got you to where you needed to be. It just took a little bit longer than might have been the case, and cricket was there alongside of it.
I think I'd say that Dad was a natural leg spinner, and we'd have many arguments in the nets. LBW. I was always pitching outside leg as far as I was concerned. But he was. He would, I would annoy him because he worked from home. He was one of those rare dads that worked from home, and he was a writer. And so he was very vulnerable to my kind of urgings of, for throwdowns in the backyard. So that was really important to me because we didn't have anyone living in the neighborhood, who could play cricket. We lived on a hill. I mean, it sounds idyllic, living in Cairns on a hill, but, as a kid growing up, there was no one around. And eventually I did find a friend. It's a South African kid who moved in next door, and his dad wanted him to play for Australia. And all I could hear, I heard him before I saw him, and the father would go, "Richard, use a straight bet." And I remember thinking, okay, he's interested in cricket. So we had some titanic struggles in the backyard, me and him. But yeah, I was a bit of a loner. I was an only child, and so cricket was everything to me. It's like getting, as I say in the book, if we on a Sunday get home from church, we went to church, yes. Put the white shirt on with the Greg Chappell thing ironed on, whatever it was, that kind of pattern that was ironed on, and then just like you just build your day around the cricket. I mean, Mum would cook lunch around the same time that lunch was on and everything. It was an important part of our lives, and it really helped me. And as I say, talking of popularity, I was the only kid in Cairns who had Rupert Murdoch come to his house. But did anyone give a shit? No.
So you mentioned, so Rupert Murdoch coming to your house. Your old man Desmond is acclaimed journalist, writer, has this fascinating life. Like, I assume extrovert, just by the way you write of him. So there's this natural contrast between father and son. Yeah, look,
we're both we're both, I don't know what the psychological term is, but we're good talking to groups, not so comfortable in the one-on-one situation. All the conversations, all the best conversations I had with Dad were either driving or on the golf course when we're staring ahead. You don't want to be looking at each other in the eye. That was important. So Dad was an author, and he wrote the book. One of the books he wrote was In Search of Sir Keith Murdoch, and so it was a big deal for us with Rupert Murdoch coming for dinner. And I had to polish the 1971 Toyota Crown, and cleaned it and polished it and vacuum it and everything. And so that was the car that was going to pick Rupert up from the airport. And of course, Dad goes down to the airport in the Crown, and Rupert gets in and the car won't start. Fortunately, a neighbour is dropping her husband off at the airport, and Dad said, "Can Rupert and I get a lift back with you?" And so she goes, yeah, sure. So Dad sat in the front and Rupert sat in the back, and the neighbour's 2-year-old daughter hit Rupert over the head with a Jemima doll all the way home, and I was sent to bed, so I didn't get a chance to see him. But I remember sneaking out of my bedroom and just taking a peek, and he was sitting on the sofa, and that was the first celebrity I ever saw. I remember being pretty kind of, wow, that's Rupert Murdoch.
It's funny, you mentioned that's the first celebrity you saw. You end up seeing a lot of them. Like, I mean, obviously you're a celebrity now yourself, but like in terms of the way your life, the rhythms of your life have often been punctuated with celebrity. But before getting into that, I want to go a bit internal here, because your mother, it's Delphine, right? That's how I pronounce her name.
Yeah, Delphine. Yeah,
Delphine.
Yeah.
I think it's important to set up your story, that the sort of very tender way you describe her caring for you, I think that informs a lot of what we see later, that you go into the book about how she's the one that kind of detects that you might need a bit more than, as I said before, than the average kid. And, I love the way that you describe her own writing and watching her and observing her doing her work as a writer. In and around all this cricket, there's this very sort of emotional, personal story you're going out to try and tell.
Yeah, she was so much like, obviously if you can imagine the archetypal Jewish mother, we talk about that in a cultural context, Larry David's mother or whoever's mother, it's George's mother. But it's kind of, so it's like, have you eaten? Are you okay? She'd always kind of try and boost me up all the time, and she was fully into me watching cricket. She was, she loved, she made fun of the names. She used to always joke that you never, Brett Lee is actually one syllable, Brett Lee. she never kind of, she had no idea what was going on, but she appreciated that I loved it. And she meant everything to me, and was a very sensitive person. And the way she interviewed people, because she was a journalist, she was a food writer, and she wrote for House and Garden, and she wrote for Vogue, and she wrote for Gourmet Traveller. And so the way she interviewed people is like, people would end up saying the most outrageous things to her because she was such an empathetic listener, It wasn't like, it's the complete opposite to one of those journalists who ask the big tough questions and everything. She'd just go, "Oh yeah, right, okay." And then what happened? And then people would just just unfurl their deepest and darkest thoughts to her. So she was a fascinating person, but she played it very low key, because Dad was the kind of, he was very much a Hemingway type of person, cigars and red wine, and the great journalist Peter McFarlane. He would often come to our house, and I get on the red with Dad, and Dad thought he was, because he was quite young, Peter McFarlane, when he first came to the house, and Dad thought he was a bit boisterous and a bit of a loudmouth. And that was the first time we met him, because he got pretty drunk. He was with a journalist called Ian Woolridge, who was an old friend of Dad's. Ian Woolridge was a famous sports journalist for the Daily Mail, beautiful writer. And so Woolridge and Dad and Peter McFarlane all got on the red. And then we never thought we'd see Peter McFarlane again. And then 3 days later, this package was couriered to me, and it was the framed autographs of the Australian and England cricket team. I think would it have been the 82, 83, Ash? Does that make sense? 82,
that's
83?
Right. Yep.
The year before you were born, I think, mate.
Yeah, that's right.
and so, yeah, it was, and we, from that moment on, we thought, oh, Peter McFarlane, he's great. And he came to our house, and then 5 years later, about 25 years later, I was asked to play him in How's That, the Kerry Packer story, which they didn't know that I knew him. And Peter McFarlane, 6'2", blonde hair, kind of classic Australian good looks, and, a 5'9" redhead was asked to play him. So I hope none of his relatives were too offended.
It's funny you say that, because when I did watch How's That, I imagine him looking like you. And obviously it's not quite the same, having blown up the World Series yarn for the age way back when.
Yes.
And I guess that soap opera that cricket can offer sometimes. That's the first summer that you dig into, 1981, Underarm, which of course you've done other work on subsequently. But I found it interesting that you went to school the next day and you were kind of on the side of the team, that they'd done the right thing. Your instinct was to sort of back our boys, as it were, even if...
I've got bleed green and gold. It's like, I've got a lot of friends, especially my age group, because I was born in the early 70s. So a lot of my friends like Sam Pang and Waleed Ali, they all go for the West Indies. It was all like, that's the kind of cool thing to do, is to go for the West Indies. I just can't understand it. It's like, to me, why would you turn your back on those guys,
It's interesting. In the book, you use we and us and them and they. Like you very much, I find that interesting, that even now, and I won't sort of spoil the ending, so to speak, about where you get to with your life in cricket by the end of the 12th chapter. But in writing this book, you do use the we and us, like we won the toss, they went out to bat first, and so on. Was that an editorial decision that you made in the writing, that you had to kind of pick a mode and stick with it?
Look, I just noticed I was doing it, and then I asked the publishers if that was a problem, and they said no. Look, I mean, the key thing is, and what separates me from from what you guys do, incredible cricket punditry generally, is that I'm totally biased and totally emotional about everything. And I was thinking, is this bad? Are people going to laugh at me for being so one-eyed? And then I reread Nick Hornby's Fever Pitch, and I went, oh no, you're allowed to do that.
Yeah. Oh, it's funny. Even in our industry, I note that Gideon does it. Gideon, when on Offsiders, for example, he will use we and us, talking of the Australian cricket team. And I've never actually asked him about that. I suspect it's because, pop psychology here, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. It's because Gideon is still part of the pyramid, right? He still plays cricket to this day, still plays on a Saturday or a Sunday with the Arrows, and thus it's still his cricket team. He's still part of that production line that at the end of it, at the top of it, if you like, is the 11 guys or 11
He's still got a chance.
Walk out and represent Australia.
Yeah, that's right. Well, what's it? Is he kind of is he a tweaker, or is he like a medium pacer?
I think he was. When I've seen him play, he was doing a bit of both, actually, bowling medium pace. I saw him win the grand final that he wrote about, Invincibles, all those years ago, having never won a premiership. I went down when he was playing in a grand final, 7 or 8 years ago, and they won, and they cheered him off the ground. It was amazing. He actually executed a direct hit run out, like that might have been the 7th or 8th wicket to fall. That was a real turning point in making sure the Arrows won that flag. So as committed as anyone to playing sort of week in, week out.
Well,
I love that.
Yeah, it was really important to me. Like it's been to represent who I am is like the green and gold, the baggy green, following all that. It's so important. Even when my two clubs are both badly behaved. My two teams are both badly behaved teams. It's the Carlton Football Club and the Australian Cricket Team. So, any sense of morality or goodness, it actually means nothing to me anymore. I don't think I've backed those guys in. So, and that's the end.
And I think you sort of earned the right, given you were, you went through the Badlands. I mean, your childhood, my childhood. I mean, I am 5 in 1989, which is the start of the, as your cricketing consciousness starts to emerge, I suppose. I don't know what it is to see Australia lose, really, through my youth. Not
so that was the
meaningfully.
Ashes of '89.
Yeah, so I remember as a very little boy, understanding the significance of Australia winning the Ashes in England. Only peripherally, but I remember the highlights or whatever it is. You, on the other hand, you're a little bit older than that, but bridging 81 to 87, which is the second chapter about that World Cup. But, there's the Rebel Tours, there's the Windies thumping Australia both at home and away. And in the middle of all of that is your man, Alan Border, who's somehow having to keep this show on the road. It feels apt that you're sort of at a one-day international between Australia and the Windies at the Gabba for your 13th birthday, that being a really significant moment in your life through that stretch of time when there wasn't much going for Australian cricket, but you were there sort of for them from an early age. It might have galvanised you yet further that they were so poor through that period.
It was such if you could imagine what it'd be like. The first observation was, if you look at like any of the underarm footage, was just how thin everyone was, not just on the on the ground, but in the crowd. They're guzzling so much beer, but they're also thin. So I don't know what was going on. We just weren't eating sugar in those days. And Greg Chappell particularly was like rake thin. And even if you look at Tubby Taylor, Tubby, he wasn't that fat at all. He was quite svelte.
There's the pull-out quote. Tubby, he wasn't that fat.
That's right. Bernie was a little bit fat. But yeah, Border had that nickname Pugsley and which kind of signified that maybe he was a bit tubby himself, but he wasn't. I got Alan Border's autograph. I was a Kim Hughes fan. Kim Hughes, before he became captain, was just such a free hitting play. Just he batted with such freedom, and he was kind of like consumable as well. If you're a young boy and you're watching cricket, Lilly and Marsh were kind of scary, and so you kind of went, oh, maybe Kim Hughes. He's kind of he's consumable. You can take him home to meet mum. And then I met Border, and Border said, I made the mistake of asking me how I was, and then I just spilled out all this information that I knew about him, because I used to religiously read those Q&As in the Cricket Australia magazine, or Australian Cricketer magazine. And I knew his favourite drink was Tia Maria milk. And I said, Mr. Border, do you still drink Tia Maria milk? and Dad was there, but Dad and Alan Border both laughed. And at the end of it, Alan Border said I was a good kid. And after that, I was a massive Alan Border fan. I just lived and died Alan Border. I really wanted his average to always be over 50. That was very important to me. But yeah, that was so depressing from the 81 Ashes I cried all the way through it. Apart from that, I think the first test.
Yeah, apart from winning at Lords.
So yeah. As soon as Botham wasn't captain anymore and Brearley took over, I started crying, and then just watching us. You'd have to understand. Graham Wood in a one-dayer. Graham Wood would get out and they go to the ads and they'd show 3 ads during a wicket, and when you came back from the break, Greg Chappell had already gone out onto the ground, got out, and was walking back to the pavilion. So, because he was going through his run of outs.
Yeah,
these are dark times in Australian cricket. It was just the greatest batsman just could not hit the ball. It was like Ian Baker Finch style kind of uselessness. It was just terrible. And so, we had we steadied the ship with a few series. Whenever Chappell took over the captaincy, we kind of steadied the ship. And then there was just this horror time. And 89, of course, was the turnaround. So and that was your first series. So you've never really lived through the dark times. I think you've spoken about this on The Greatest Season It Was too. You guys, the three of you, never really kind of lived through the pain.
That's it. We have all talked about how we had the dark times with footy rather than cricket, kind of as kids growing up. It's just like one success after another. I like that.
When did you have a dark time? When did Hawthorn Football Club
we didn't play in a final between 91, or didn't win a final rather between 91 and 2000. So, they're that decade's when I'm at school, right? And Hawthorn are fairly routinely towards the bottom of the ladder. I like that. I like that bit. This is kind of going to be a weird bit to pull out, but I'm going to pull it out anyway. Of that day when you're at the cricket for your 13th birthday, and you spend about 4 paragraphs describing the odour of a man's fart, and I reckon that's significant because, again, I kind of touched on this before, but when you're thinking about your youth, there can be certain sense and moments in time which you identify with smell, and I find it interesting that for the fact that you're seeing all your heroes play for the first time, they're playing against the Windies, which is a whole other thing in that era, being the best team in the world, yet you spent more words devoted to a bloke's fart than anyone else that was perhaps at the Gabba that day. Do you think there's something in that?
Yeah, it was very potent because you're dead right, mate. You know, that the memory of the grass when you turn up to a junior cricket fixture. I mean, you'll never forget the scent of freshly mown grass on a summer's day. And yeah, that fight was significant because we'd lost the game. We'd lost the game terribly. It was just so humiliating. What I would say is that a 19-year-old Craig McDermott was bowling faster than Michael Holding that day. I'm pretty sure, pretty certain of it. Not as fast as Malcolm Marshall, but and Alan Border was hitting the groin. By Viv Richards, actually, a Viv Richards dart.
Right.
I collected Alan Board in the groin, and Clive Lloyd held up his legs. That's all I remember. To the hooting of the crowd. And, you know, it was back in the day, there was full strength beer on the hill. And I just remember us walking up. We're all depressed. We're walking underneath this overpass to get to Vulture Street at the Gabba. And someone let out a fart. And it was a 12 beer, 3, steak and kidney pie, 4 and 20 steak and kidney pie fart. You know, it was a man's fart. It was a fart I hadn't actually experienced, and the scent of which I hadn't experienced before. You know, boys' farts are very benign compared to a full, like whatever was going on in that guy's gut was just so wrong and potent. And I remember that, and I remember thinking, you know, I'd say I'll never forget the fart. It was the scent of failure. You know.
En route to when Australia have the centre victory in the 87 World Cup, we go via your time at Brisbane Grammar, which, I mean, it's the full fucking bit, isn't it? It's boarding school. Yeah. It's literally dick measuring. It's the wank police. It's the public shaming. It's the ritual beatings. It's later actual criminality from that time with someone who went to prison over what they did there in charge of the boys. But, I mean...
Yep.
Have you had a chance to reflect? My interest in this was that, you hear those stories, right? You hear those stories a lot from people that went to boarding school at a certain time and before. But the boy, I know you changed names in the story, so not to sort of throw people under the bus, but have you Facebook stalked some of these monsters at age 14, 15 who acted abysmally and sought out to see where they ended up in their lives? Or indeed other boys like you who are on the receiving end of this bullshit and had no way of combating it? Like, is there a sense of fascination from you now as a 49-year-old as to kind of what happened to these people who were so broken so young?
None of the bullies are on Facebook. I can't find them anywhere.
Interesting.
They were proper bullies because the school was divided into two, and not halves. There was 200 boarders and there was probably 1,200 in the day school. And in the day school, they're very academic. They all had to pass a test to get in there and everything. And the 200 boarders, they didn't have to pass any test. They all came from Queensland grazier families, or like me, just like ring-ins from regional Queensland. And who knows what it was like? It was late 80s in the boarding house. Who knows what the reason for this is, but any form of wanking was verboten. In fact, there was a kind of a self-appointed group of people who were called the wanking police, who would leap over the dividers of the toilet and just check to see that you weren't wanking. All right. Goodness, and if you were wanking, then it was the end of your career. You could just forget about, any sort of popularity at school or anything like that. And there was 2 or 3 guys when I was there who got busted wanking, and it was just devastating for them. It was the ritual humiliation all the way from. It never let up on these people for the whatever period they were at school. It was just all from the moment they were busted wanking onwards. They just became targets. And many years later, I did run into one of those guys. And he he was in the same industry I'm in, and he asked me to see something he'd cut together. And in the middle of it, he just started, like, I walked in, and I was just like, yeah, mate. And then he just started crying. He just started bursting into tears because just seeing me reminded him of that hell that he went through. And, and I feel he was a really sweet guy who came to the school in grade 10 and just wasn't aware of those rules. And, but we're always mates and at school, and I hadn't seen him for about 15 years. And I think he came and saw a play I was in. Yeah. And I said, I'm making films as well. Come and have a look at this thing that I've cut together. And I went, yeah, sure. And then, like, I didn't know what to do because I'm not a mental health professional. But he was completely damaged by that period. And there's, a lot of guys have read the book and have reached out and confirmed essentially what I said, because I was worried about it, because you do worry that you've actually distorted things in your mind. And we're all kind of, apparently the school's brilliant now. Just great, complete change, cultural change. So so the school that Matt Renshaw went to is very different to the one I went to.
I hope so. Another person that's been on the final word in the past. I suppose, the 87 World Cup, you talk of sort of that, again, that quite relatable thing of listening to the World Cup. Mm. And as we found in the greatest season it was when going through this, of course, you couldn't listen to it and watch it at the same time because the broadcast cut out after the first innings of the World Cup final. Imagine that. Actually, that might have been in Calling the Shots, come to think of it. But either way, they had the rights.
It wasn't on. Sorry?
Well, in some markets, I think we worked out that in some markets, you could, I think Dan Brady South Australia and other markets, you could only watch the first innings. And in Sydney, they didn't take it at all or something like that. Australia in a World Cup final, and they've seen fit to show, reruns of films and all the rest of it ahead of showing the finale. And instead you were, listening to the wireless at Bedim at boarding school, this brutal boarding school.
Yeah, like I can't even remember now. I've listed the films that were on instead of the second innings, the World Cup final. It was, and what a story with Simon O'Donnell of knowingly playing with cancer.
Awful. It's absolutely awful.
Yeah, you just wouldn't hear about that. And Bob Simpson convincing him to play in the final.
You can only imagine, without being sort of overly sort of grim about it. Had he died, it would be. I sort of thought about this again. We dealt with the Simon O'Donnell story recently on the history program on the weekend, and I was already thinking about it, and then had to have it kind of reinforced by your telling of the story, which I didn't know that much detail, that he was kind of pushed out the door. If he had have died from not having been treated to play a game of cricket, it doesn't even bear to imagine.
Yeah, and like how tough all those guys were too, because he was so sick he couldn't lead the team's song in that after the semi-final against Pakistan. And that's all the guys giving him shit. and he's like, I am on death's door. I can't tell you what I got because that'll create a massive scandal. But he didn't really know. He didn't want to know. So everyone's giving him shit. They were hard people. They were like, those guys were hard men. And so I listened to it in the boarding house, and that gave me because it was a pretty tough boarding house. It was pretty ruthless, and that listening to Christopher Martin Jenkins and Henry Blofeld and just hearing the poetry of the way they describe cricket was a magical experience, coupled with the fact that Gadding did the reverse sweep and we won.
Yes.
So it was just happy days on so many fronts for me, because just hearing such intelligence and kind of artistry in the way you describe a sport meant so much to me at the time, and I was kind of like proud to be. This is my game. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And commentary is such a subjective thing about what we enjoy and what we don't enjoy. But the very act of listening to the cricket, there's that intimacy there. I think that the commentators that you listen to as a kid, you'll always have a special bond with them. In your case, CMJ and Blowers, and in my case, someone like Jim Maxwell, for example, who and others, but Jim's a good example of somebody who has narrated like these wonderful summer days deep into the day.
Yeah.
Later on, I suppose on ABC, someone like Kerry O'Keefe, who was such a big part of the fun for a number of years there. Overseas as well, Jonathan Agnew. I mean, you describe, and this comes up later in the book, his commentary of the Steve Waugh 100 on the final ball of the day. I was there in the Brawongle stand that day, having come up from Melbourne for that test match to watch what I thought would be Steve Waugh's final test, and listening to that commentary of Agnew and Kerry O'Keefe together. You never forget that.
No.
There is that intimacy, because you... Probably in the same way with podcasting, there's a similar thing going on. People take you, they actively choose to take you with them, whether you're in the shower or whatever it is, in the car, on a walk. Whereas with television, it's like you have to sit down and make a decision to be in front of it. Maybe not so much now with phones and tablets, but for a long time it was like you sat down and made a decision, whereas radio kind of follows you. I think that might add to why it's such a deeply held thing.
Yeah, I mean, even when I lived in America, listening to baseball on the radio, suddenly it clicked for me. More so than TV. So
sure.
What I loved about calling the shots was Tim Lane in the '99 World Cup semi-final, not thinking he would call it because not thinking he'd call the victory because he didn't think Australia would win, or and then suddenly he's called upon to do it. I've listened to that a bunch of times, and of course the exchange between, in the same tournament, the exchange between David Gow and Tony Gregg when Herschel drops the World Cup, and he goes, Tony's saying you could almost make a case for saying that was out, and Gow was saying, "Afraid not, Tony.
Afraid not. It's brilliant. Yeah, that's right. There's those moments of commentary that live with you. I love it now, even when people write in or whatever with the work we're doing and say that, it means a lot to them to sort of be with us on our journeys around the world and in commentary boxes and so on. That stuff, that means an awful lot.
Yeah, and it's a fleeting game. So what you guys do is like, and I've said this a few times too, it's like, because we don't, sometimes you're just sitting there and you go, did that happen? Did I just see this remarkable feat? And then to hear you guys kind of do your wrap up of the game, it's like, oh yes, it did happen. It's solidified. I wasn't imagining it. There is a shared experience. There is a group consciousness going on, and that's that's.
I think that's right. It's the commonality, isn't it, that you're going through? It's like when you would, I guess it's not so much a thing now, but for a time, buy an album at the same time that all your mates were buying an album, and you would sort of talk about that experience. It's a solo experience listening to an album more often than not. But if you go out on a Saturday night and a song comes on from the album and you can all sing and dance together, there's something there that I think now we've got so much choice with music that it's unlikely that you'd all go out and listen to the album at the same time.
I mean, so you started in '89 with cricket, right? So what you have to understand is now with it, everything's so fragmented. Like, in music, everyone knew what the top 10 was. Everyone was watching some kind of dead rubber between Australia and New Zealand, in a World Series Cup. It was just, we're all watching it in those days. It was a group
What choice was there?
What choice
was on the telly?
There
were three channels, and one of them was the cricket. So where else would you be?
Yeah, I know. And we all talked about it at school.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it must be very different growing up now as a kid when there may not be that same sort of shared experience. Something to keep an eye on with my own girl, I suppose, as she gets older. You mentioned '89. Interesting that you don't use that as your next landmark. I quite like that you talk about '89, but you don't indulge too much in it. You get quite quickly to the '92 World Cup. I like the bit about Ian Healy not even remembering where his shirt is from that tournament and sort of wanting to forget about it. I feel like the same way with you, having a little bit earlier than that, wanted to get as far away from grammar as you could, and thus you end up at the University of Southern Queensland. Is that right? Sunshine Coast?
There was it's USQ, USQ. Which was called, that before I went there, it was called the DDIAE, Darling Downs Institute of Advanced Education, and the ad to attract people to the university or whatever it was if you want a degree, go to DDIAE. And so I wanted a degree. And but fortunately it was USQ. But yeah, 89. I think I touched on a little bit. I mean, the most significant thing for me at that stage was Border doing the no speakies with Gower, and that was fascinating.
Yeah, so Captain Grumpy and all of that. You do a good job around that era, I reckon. Of it's hard to know whether you were there then or whether you're kind of projecting, your current satisfaction on your emotions then. But it feels like that's the point when you're able to take the piss out of yourself a little bit more in the book. Like, you kind of quite self-deprecating around your first girlfriend doing you over, and you kind of realise that you want to be in front of the camera, you want to be on stage, even though you're studying journalism and it was going to take a lot of craft. But you kind of at that point, you're kind of seeing what you're going to be as an adult a little bit. Just for listeners, I had a girlfriend who broke up with me, and this is 91, 92, maybe 91, 92, and she got a car stolen, and the police went around to her house and said, "Is there anyone who might be upset with you at the moment?" And she said, "Oh, well, I did break up with my ex-boyfriend. And what's his name?" And so these two guys in Roger David suits came into the common dining area at the college I was at, and took me downtown, roughed me up a bit, and then the car turned up while I was there, and they didn't even give me a cab charge to get back to the uni. But yeah, it was 92. That was a Dan Bredick quote. Where he interviewed Heels, and Heels had kept the shirts of every tournament he'd ever been in except the 92 World Cup, which we completely threw away. But it was an overpacked schedule. Australia were already exhausted by the time they, for the first game, and also just not knowing who the openers were. I think it wasn't until I think they settled on Tom Moody that things started to turn around. I mean, Tom Moody, kind of being a steadying hand in 7 years later in the 99 World Cup. Yeah, as well. I guess the fact that he'd been there in 87 as well didn't hurt his cause at that particular juncture. You kind of go through the back end of Border, right? So there's, everyone knows the heartbreak of 93 at Adelaide. Every Australian fan can identify with McDermott and May and those last 43 runs that wasn't quite. And I quite like the sort of the Border farewell lap. There's that to an extent saying goodbye, but not quite knowing when he necessarily would retire. He didn't foreshadow his retirement in the way that, say, Steve Waugh would a generation later. I always thought it's fitting that Border finishes his international career scrapping out a draw on the final day of a test match that nobody's really at the end of a series that isn't televised back to Australia.
100%. That's right. I mean, someone, who was it? Was it Dravid or someone who said, that what were they playing South Africa or were they playing India?
The last test that Border played in.
Yeah.
Border's last test is that South Africa series in 94. So 94. that final day, and Border, I think he has a go at Mark Waugh and says something like, in classic Border fashion, we're fucking batting to the end. And so they batted to the end. So, Border 42 not out off about 1 million deliveries, and Waugh makes 100 on the way through. But, it's to me, it's like he didn't need the adulation of, one more round around Australia or whatever it is, because he had his 10,000th run moment, and, there was that, had the average above 50 again that you've talked about, had the farewell lap around England in a way, I suppose, and that hilarious video with Craig McDermott that you referenced. I know we're all Robert Linda fans here, but he'd reached that degree of notoriety that he didn't need that extra bit at the end. He was happy with his lot in life.
Isn't that interesting? Because you do see that, Ponting he didn't play as many tests as Ponting and Waugh, did he?
He played as, you're right. Yeah, that's right. They both overtook him. I think maybe he played more than Steve Waugh, but certainly he didn't play as many as Ponting. But you're right. His career was so long.
It felt so long. And it felt like he was never going to give it up. And not that I wanted him to go, because I couldn't really imagine if you'd gone through the trauma of Kim Hughes, you didn't want to know what was at the other end. You're worried that if Mark Taylor took over, that it could all be a disaster again. So you were concerned. But that turned out great. He was amazing. But and then Border played that one last season for Queensland, and I mentioned the book. I think that I played junior cricket with Jimmy Marr, and Jimmy Marr ran Border out in his first class game. and and he does talk about just never wanting to go back into the pavilion, just walking around before he didn't want to go into the dressing room at tea because he was scared. And then I think someone said to him, "You just go up and apologise. He'll be all right."
It would have been a lot easier had, Steve Smith taken that approach a couple of weeks ago at Gaul rather than becoming a massive story for about 2 weeks.
What was that like in the com box? I mean,
well, I think we all arrived at exactly the same conclusion at exactly the same time, which doesn't say an awful lot about where he's at the moment as a human being, more than the cricketer.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a.
Khawaja did. He liked something on my Instagram the other day, so he's fine by me.
Fair enough. Jumping. I love your kind of love letter to Dean Jones. That I think it's the 4th chapter of the book where you. I mean, obviously you're an emotional kid, and and so was I, and I felt Dean Jones passing quite closely because I knew him a little bit, But I'm 12 years younger than you, so I get the being a Victorian, the sense of. Injustice at the end of his career, not being picked and all the rest. But you saw the whole thing. You got the exciting bit the whole way through. I mean, my memory of Jones begins as he's, the absolutely dominant white ball player, but really it's not far away from the end of his Test career. Whereas you've lived it. You document beautifully the Madras 210, Australia's changing relationship with India. There's a quote here: Jones made cricket unmissable. Nobody walked away from the TV when he was at the crease. That's how I've described it when Glenn Maxwell bats these days. You kind of just got to watch. Yeah. You don't know how it's going to end, but you're duty bound to go for the ride, and you had a dozen years of that with Dino.
Interesting that the 3 Victorians in Jones, Warne, and Maxwell, the three superstars. You just don't want to. You never wanted to walk away from the television. And Jones, it was just one of those things. You just didn't know that cricket could be like that. And you've got to imagine a pre-Warne era. It was kind of strange. Maybe Derek Randall was someone like that you kind of went, oh wow. I just can't take my eyes off you. You're amazing. Apart from the West Indies, of course. But it was like just seeing Jones. Everything about him was show business. From the zinc cream to the footwork, to just like he was more energetic. He was just as energetic around the crease as Smith is. It was like he just was on the move the whole time, and. He was kind of handsome as well. So it was, it was everything. And just to see him edged out by that kind of, Australian cricket can be so conservative, and that plays to its advantage on occasion, but you just saw the kind of the powers that be just edging him away. And I never knew why. I still don't know exactly why, because I'm not in the inner circles of these conversations, but I just felt like you just knew that it was injustice. And it's the same, it's a little bit the same with Maxi. The good thing for Maxi is a multi-millionaire, so that's fine. But Jones wasn't, not then.
Yeah, not in the same way, right? Like Maxwell gets to have this career separate to the Australian team, whereas for Jones, there was playing for Victoria, playing county cricket, but it was, so much around that. And yes, sure, the Australia A thing would have been great had it played out and he had led that side. As your theory went, they couldn't make him captain because Australia A would have been too popular had Jones. It was popular enough as it is, and I suppose people like you and I both identified with the underdog during that great summer, which kind of corresponds. Mate, you go. Sorry.
Oh, it's just your series like that. Like for me. When I saw the greatest season that was the podcast that you guys did, and those 3 things that you touched on, Australia A, 99 World Cup, and the Final Frontier, that were those 3 things that really meant a lot to me as well. Oh, and cool. That Australia A, again, it's you go through these things in life, and you started this conversation by talking about cricket, being signposted. It almost makes us remember what we're doing at different times in our life. And the Australia A thing was such a big deal to so many of us. And the fact that it's just a little island that was never repeated properly, and it was just a little kind of a moment in time. And, we all hope Jones would make we all hope Jones would make a comeback. That's the least we I thought he should have been playing for Australia, but sure, make him Australia 8. I mean, that's a consolation prize, but no, they couldn't be asked doing that. And Chappell and Taylor were kind of towing the line and saying, yeah, he's not getting any younger. I mean, I think he was younger than Merv Hughes, who was playing.
He was about 33, I think, or something like that. It was a spurious argument at best when you consider that, we think of 33-year-olds now as being potentially with some of their best cricket ahead of them, but they made their call on Jones. It's around the same time here that you're not making the cut at acting school. You end up back washing dishes in cans. You're back in your childhood bedroom. You're trawling the job ads. It does work out in the end as far as getting a job as a journo in Brisbane, sort of entry-level journo, writing about the Broncos and all the rest of it. But I guess there's that tension point where just when you're about to set off to the big smoke to be a journalist for the first time, even though acting hadn't quite worked out at that juncture, that's when you find out from your old man that your mum's got breast cancer, and there's this kind of stunning realisation that I'm leaving home again, but God knows what's going to be at home when I come back next time.
Yeah. So I would have been 22, 23 at the time, and maybe 22, and I'd done a bit of work at the Innisfail Advocate, and then I got this job writing about the Broncos for the Sunday Telegraph Brisbane edition. And as I was driving to the bus station, Dad told me that Mum's got breast cancer, and I said, I was just devastated because I'd had a pretty protected life, really. It was the shit storm of boarding school, but as far as everything else was concerned, things have been plain sailing, as it kind of is for most people, I reckon. It's unusual to have major grief in your life, before 22. And so I was just in a state of panic the whole time. But moved to Brisbane and was there for 3 months at the Sunday Telegraph Brisbane edition. And then it folded. And then I think I just did a bit of freelance, and I remember just thinking, I don't know what I'm going to do. I have to go back to Cairns. And Mum was pretty crook at the time. And I got cast in an ad to play. It was a craft cheese dip ad where I was a chicken, had to play a chicken and was dumped in a pool of Cheese Whiz, it was called. and I remember this is not about, but my friend Jason Gann, who ended up playing Wilfred, he'd done a lot of children's theatre, and he was well versed in wearing animal costumes. And he said, when you're acting in an animal costume, you're allowed at least one tantrum per day. And I took that to heart. And this, the fourth or fifth time I'm dropped into this kind of Cheese Whiz, the chicken head that I was wearing was just like weighing probably about 30 kilos. And I just couldn't move my neck and everything. That's where I threw my tantrum.
Heavy as the head that wears the chicken crown.
That's right.
I love it. It's a really interesting part of your life. I've sort of mentioned before, we anyone who's listening to this podcast will know how it all ends up for you, right? But it's that route to where you get there that's the texture there. So like even the moving to Melbourne after the chicken gig goes okay, $100 a week accommodation, grim as it comes.
Yeah.
You end up at the Sunday Herald Sun. Alan Howe, who I had a bit to do with a long time ago now.
Oh, really?
You ended up, winning your job on the back of your Beatles album preference, which is perfectly in keeping with the Alan Howe I remember from my political days, and him sending me through CDs of the Fleet Foxes and of different different Dylan albums that he knew I needed to listen to, and that kind of thing. But you're a tabloid journalist working for him, and I'm tipping he was a pretty hard boss. And that's kind of where we segue into this mid-90s part. Use another World Cup to signpost your life, but this is this weird Melbourne bit where you haven't got enough money from working for the paper, so you're working as a driver for an escort, sometimes a security detail for her if things didn't go quite right. You got this nocturnal life. And you're trying to be a journo by day. You don't really want to do either. And you're just kind of scrapping to keep your head above water.
Yeah, it's like you don't really know. You don't really know the path to where you want to get to. I moved to Melbourne. I had enough money to move to Melbourne, set up at the Oslo Hotel, $100 a week. That was in Grey Street, St Kilda. And I remember arriving there, to carry on the tradition, I'd bought a Toyota Crown, a mustard color 1974 Toyota Crown. So I wasn't the coolest guy arriving in Grey Street, St Kilda. But the first person I saw just walking down on this gloomy St Kilda day was Tex Perkins. He looked about as miserable as I felt. And so my flatmate in Brisbane was a stripper, and she said, if you need money, because I wasn't going to get paid for the first month at the Sunday Herald Sun. So she said, if you need money, I know some places that need drivers for strippers. And I went, yeah, sure. So I rang up and they said, we don't need any drivers for strippers, but we need drivers for escorts. And part of that job is also you drive the escort from job to job. And if they get in any strife, you've got to go in and rescue them. And, I'm not a fighter at all. But fortunately, I talk about in the book that the chicken ad did save my ass once, because one guy who was actually keeping a woman there against her will, I went in there to try and, talk some sense into him, and he ended up being a fan of the chicken ad. And I don't know if he loved, he hated it so much he loved it. Maybe that was it. Either way, I distracted him long enough for her to get out. But I was listening to the 96 World Cup going on, on those long nights in Melbourne, driving around the eastern suburbs, like Box Hill and that kind of area, which is pretty gloomy. And just having the 96 World Cup going on in the background saved me, because there wasn't any internet or anything. It wasn't like I could look at my phone. It was just so boring. And also what was another thing that I remember, because the women, it wasn't a glamorous job, driving escorts. That, it was just like women who had kind of just wanted some extra money. Some of them were teachers and nurses, and they just wanted a bit of extra money just to get ahead. And some of them were married, and I remember the one woman I was driving, her husband had just been sacked from the Ford plant or retrenched from the Ford plant. And what's the suburb that Eddie Maguire comes from?
Broadmeadows.
Yeah. And and I remember, driving her around, and she was a lovely lady. And she used to kind of like hover around my car. Like she'd finish a job and she'd walk up to my car, and then she'd just stand outside it for about 40 or 50 seconds. And then finally one day I said, why do you stand outside the car for so long before you actually get in? And she said, the hardest thing about sex work is not having sex with people that you find unattractive. The hardest thing is holding a fart in for 2 hours.
Yeah, that's... I love the layer of detail that you remember from those experiences, and again, like sort of having that World Cup, albeit an unsuccessful one for Australia, as the soundtrack. I also thought it was nice how you actually painted a picture of what was going on at Sri Lanka at the time. I think I read that chapter in Sri Lanka, and that you sort of didn't skim over the fact that it was pretty rough over there then and there, and it was a big decision for them to make, and it kind of bridges through to when Australia have Steve Waugh as the new captain in 1999, and by this point, you're writing, I mentioned your relationship with celebrity before, but you're writing a lot of celebrity profiles on the paper in Melbourne, all sorts of anecdotes from that stage sort of your life. But also this is where you get into the war-worn stuff from 99, his non-selection in that final test match, which is what most people remember from that series, other than Brian Lara's genius. And I suppose you would have written that. Of course, you wrote it before he passed away. Reading it back myself, I thought, yeah, that's fair. I mean, you don't sort of unfairly criticise Warren for how he responded. You're quite measured in your criticism of all parties in that passage. And I suppose, to borrow the old Darren Hinch, all you can give the dead is the truth, right?
Well, that's really interesting. The thing about greatness that I've noticed is that people who end up being great think that they're great before they're actually great. Does that make sense? It's like, you might even get a cricketer who hasn't quite matured as a, batsman or a bowler, but he thinks he's great before he actually becomes great. And I remember, a young Russell Crowe just thinking he was famous way before he was actually famous, and Warren had already been great, but he didn't realize what we were seeing after his operation. You know, there was just no kind of, there was no, he wasn't the bowler that we knew and love. There was no bite to his bowling. There was no sting. It was pretty just flat. And I think Shanda Paul actually says you were guaranteed at least 2 or 3 easy deliveries every over, and you would never say that about Warne before that. So he just wasn't. I mean, he shouldn't have been playing in that 99 West Indies series. He shouldn't really have been playing. But fortunately, he did play because it probably just gave him the match practice he needed for late in the World Cup tournament that followed that.
Yeah, that's right.
Beautifully.
Well, and that's where you go to next. And, you know, we all know the story of Australia, from the booze ban at the start to the sort of old firm returning in the middle of the tournament, the wild win in the semi-final, and so it goes. Again, kind of using your own life as the signpost through that stretch of time, that's when you pretty much decide that being a tabloid journo is no longer for you, when you're called up to Jack Elliott's house on a Saturday night when he's been on the piss and right. drink driving, and suddenly your impromptu interview with his wife Amanda ends up on the front page, and you're like, I just don't have the stomach for this. Like, this is just too much for you. Even though you were celebrated for getting the yarn and the love you got in the newsroom for coming back with a screaming yarn for page 1 on a Sunday, it just wasn't, for you, just wasn't worth it.
No, John Elliott was busted for drink driving, and I had to go down to his house, and I wasn't a foot into the door, journo. You know, there were a lot of them, but I wasn't one of those guys. I was like, the reason why I was attracted to writing about celebrities, you know, it was because the interview was nice and organized, and in those days particularly, you didn't really need to get a big story. It was just like, you know, tell us about your album. So anyway, I was sent down on a Saturday night to Toorak, St George's Road, and pressed the intercom, and Amanda Elliott let me in the house and she was like really worried about John Elliott, what had happened to him, because he hadn't called. And he was, I don't know if he was in the lockup or whatever, but he was down, he was at police headquarters.
Still out.
Yeah. And so I was the one to break the news to her that he'd been busted drink driving, and she was really worried. And I had the tape recorder on, and she was just talking to me about how worried she was. And then I filed this stream of consciousness from her straight into the paper, and it made the 11:30 edition, which is, I think, the second edition. And then everyone was buying me drinks that night. I was a hero. And then the next morning, I went to get the paper, and because I lived in Richmond, and I was just walking around Como Park, and I saw her driving past, and she was crying. And I remember thinking, why am I involving myself in other people's lives like this? I don't want to be that person.
Yeah.
And so I kind of made a moral judgment at that stage to kind of do what I wanted to do, and which was screenwriting and acting. And so that was a big moment in my life. Just where you kind of, it's like electric shock therapy, where you just go, oh, what am I doing? This is ridiculous.
And you still get to do the fun stuff, I suppose, with celebrity writing. And I like how this kind of goes full circle with Jimmy Barnes, right? So you have this and you talked earlier about being an empathetic interviewer, and you write about that in saying you got a lot out of people. Surely that's the influence of your mum, I suppose, right? Like you overheard these interviews that she was doing, and implicitly you must have known at one point that could come in handy for you, whether you were sort of taking mental notes or otherwise. And someone like Jimmy Barnes, who I didn't realise just how broken a man he was at that point a couple of decades ago. I mean, we think of him as this quite inspirational figure these days with what he's done, you know, I guess keeping people happy through the pandemic to an extent, and all the good work that he does and the advocacy he does around the world. But that he was kind of on the edge there. It could have gone either way. And the way you get into that is the fact that, of course, Michael Slater was up on stage with him the day before they flew out for India for that extraordinary series in 2001. And, you know, that contrast you draw between Slater, who'd been on this roller coaster ride for a while, and I mean, arguably still on the roller coaster from what we read in media reports.
Yeah.
And then compared to Matthew Hayden, who was primed for the series of all series to really stamp himself as an Australian opener. But yeah, the way you get into that is via this sort of Jimmy Barnes conversation with this interviewing technique that's been successful for you.
Yeah, well, Barnesy was he just spilled his guts to me. He didn't want me to leave, and as you're dead right. That was the first time he really kind of went big on how difficult his life had been. You know, all the way, you know, from his upbringing with his mother and his mother who got angry with him. He bought her a house, and she got angry with him because she said it was too cold, and you know, so with the chisel money, I think he bought her a house.
Yeah,
and she was ungrateful, and you know, and he was getting into a lot of fights at school, and they were dirt poor, and you know, there was the kind of acrimony between him and his son David Campbell, you know, for many years before they became, you know, they settled those differences, and so he just told me everything like I was like the tape recorder wasn't on, and I went straight from there, and I, you know, wrote the story up, and it was, I mean, no thanks to me, it was an incredible story, thanks to Jimmy. And I remember just getting straight on a plane to interview AC/DC, and that was when the India test was just. That was when the India series were just starting, and you know, Australia were, as you know, and you've discussed this in chapter and verse, but I don't think we appreciated. I think we're pretty cocky going into that series, and the sheer undoing of Australia was despite Hayden, was quite extraordinary. But yeah, I was watching that with I was watching that in the hotel with AC/DC. So yeah, that was in Stuttgart, Germany.
Wow.
So I went straight from interview. Sorry, just to be clear, I straight from interviewing Jimmy Barnes in Melbourne, got straight on a plane, Stuttgart, AC/DC, and we were stuck there for a few days because there was a pilot strike, and yeah, we were watching Australia go down to India.
There's a lot there, isn't there? I mean, you mentioned Tex Perkins before. I was in the pub with Reece Muldoon the other day, who someone you've surely come across in your journey in acting, and he declared that there was only three great frontmen in Australia: Bon Scott, Tex Perkins, and Nick Cave. That was his big three of sort of great Australian frontmen, and Bon Scott kind of comes up in your book here, in that you're told by AC/DC there's one rule when interviewing AC/DC: you can't talk about Bon. But interestingly, they do constantly in your presence. I mean, So you can't really weigh in, but it's clear there's that repressed grief. I mean, by that stage, nearly quarter of a century on or thereabouts from when.
So it was 2001, and so Bon had died. Probably
70. It's late 70s, isn't it?
Yeah. Let's because your listeners all know. 1980. And yeah, so it was 21 years later, and we're allowed to talk about Bon, but Angus, I think, was happy to. Brian was always very quiet because it wasn't his place, but Malcolm was the very emotional one in the group, and he was the one that was always a little bit kind of, don't talk about Bon, because he was, I think, very emotionally connected to Bon. That was, I mean, it was such an interesting, because we're just stuck in the hotel together. It's like the interview was over. I mean, I don't know what it was like for you. I don't know if there's that kind of boundary between church and state with the media and the cricketers, but it was just like, we're in a fucking hotel together. I guess we just hang out, do we? You know, and so Angus and Malcolm were on the phone to Philip Morris, the cigarette makers, the whole time, because they were offended that there wasn't enough tar in the Benson and Hedges that they were smoking. And they were drinking milkshakes. And I remember, and Brian, he was just telling me stories about hanging out with Paul Newman and racing cars with Paul Newman in the States. And you know, it was fascinating. And then I get a knock on my door late on the first night I was there, and it was the roadie saying, Brian's going to get some stuff for his voice. He just wanted to know if you wanted to, come along for the ride. So I'm in the back of a Tarago, or the German equivalent, and we're going to this right to the other end of Stuttgart, and we go into this dodgy store. Well, I don't go in. I'm staying in the car. He goes in, and he gets some sort of package. It's like some sort of pill that's going to help him with his voice. It was like a drug run, and so he gets it, and then we get back in the car, and meanwhile he's telling all these kind of indiscreet stories about rock and roll legends, and we get back in the car, and go back to the hotel, say our goodbyes, and then next morning we're having breakfast together because what else are you going to do? And I said, how did the potion go for your voice, Brian? He said, I did nothing for my voice, but you should see the size of my cock. So yeah, that was good. And like he wanted to hang out with us, it turned out. And I thought we were kind of imposing ourselves on him, but no.
I suppose you were, to an extent, you were kind of distracted by the cricket that's playing out as well, right? I mean,
that's right.
There's this series, this all-time series, the Bradman death at the start. What I'd forgotten, which you detail, is that Australia elect to bowl first at Mumbai. We remember they win inside 3 days, and it's a stunning triumph after the death of Bradman's announced, but it's not the only punt. We think of Steve Waugh's punt enforcing the follow-on and the mythology around the follow-on that's gathered pace thereafter over the next, 21 years. But yeah, bowling first in that test match, and the fact that you're still hurting when Australia are losing at that point, it's that sort of boyish, you might have had a life in the media yourself by that stage. You're well and truly beyond the point of sort of crying into your pillow when the Australian team lose, but them not being able to conquer the final frontier under Steve Waugh still packs a punch for you.
Yeah, well, it was like he'd done so much good work about India and everything, and you're thinking that that's the chapter in the Steve Waugh book that that was the one bit of unfinished business for Steve Waugh, and so of course I personalize everything. I mean, that's the difference between me and people who take a more broader view of cricket. No, I personalize everything. It's very important. I mean, Steve Waugh and Alan Border couldn't give a fuck about me, but here I am just like sweating the small stuff about them the whole time.
Keep their average above 50 and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, that was, and I described it, just the frustration of Laxman and Dravid just not getting out. And also there's that thing, I mean, obviously we're going to touch on it probably in 2005, but Australian sportsmen need to get a lesson in Greek mythology before they actually put on the baggy green. The hubris, just like kind of the arrogance. It's obviously, again, it's very Carlton Football Club. It's just like, when are you going to realize that the gods will punish you if you act like a cocky dickhead?
Yeah.
Slater sniffing the cigar, saying tonight's the night, boy, or today's the day, boys. When Dravid and Laxman are batting, and they think they're going to roll India, and they 2 days. I always
remember that fax that was sent from the 1969 team. I think I remember hearing Keith Stackpole talk about this at the time, probably on Sports World, saying that the members of the 69 team that won under Bill Lawry sent a fax to congratulate Steve Waugh's team, and they had sent it ahead of time on the assumption that it would be received and read out to the team upon winning, because of course they'd enforce the follow-on. So the expectation is they'd win on that, I guess it would have been that fourth day, and we all know what happens next. So it kind of feeds into your idea that karma, when it comes to cricket, don't mess with the gods.
100%. Yeah. It's like you talk about me working for the Sunday Herald Sun. I got there a few years after the headline appeared, Houston in photo finish.
Yes, the 93 election.
Yeah, so there's all of that, and Steve Waugh had the Southern Comfort under his chair and everything. They're all ready to toast their first series win in India since Bill Lawry's team. Is it right? Is that right?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. So Slater was sniffing the cigars, and Waugh had the Southern Comfort, and it was all ready to go. And just can't do that, can you, mate? It's like singing the team song at three-quarter time.
Yeah, they'd get there 3 years later. What they would do is go on to England and sort of take it out on the Poms, as they tended to do at the time. But instead of sort of indulging too much in that, you go through the Justin Langer journey from that series, sort of hating the game after being left out after India, getting back for the final test. I didn't know just how intense that was, him holding Adam Gilchrist up against the locker and that kind of thing in frustration. But yeah, that's a nice way of coming at 2001, which is a bit of a forgotten Ashes series, I reckon. There are some moments that stand out, with Glenn McGrath as being brilliant and Shane Warne, but they were, to an extent, it was like a farewell tour for some of those guys who wouldn't play in another Ashes series and wouldn't dominate quite to the same extent. They'd had that long run of winning 16 in a row, but going back to England when they never really stood a chance. That's right.
I mean, but they really stood on the throat of the English for that series. And even, War making his incredible comeback for the fifth test.
Yeah.
That was, for me, that was I wanted to concentrate on Langer's personality in that. And again, you've met all these people. I haven't really met them. I'm just kind of going on the history of it all, and just like doing essentially an exhaustive look at every book that was ever written about that series. And Langer just couldn't hit the ball out of the square. He was just like, he was terrible. And then you don't know how much pressure he put on War and Buchanan. Because, there's a lot of people in the Slater camp who said he shouldn't have got axed, was axed. And then Langer came out for that fifth test, just a completely different batsman. It was just like the spirit of Slater had got inside Langer. And suddenly he was aggressive. It was quite a remarkable thing.
Yeah, it's a really lucky break. I mean, it's a real, because, the convention would have been stick with Slater, but certainly not to turn to a bloke who's battling. I mean, they'd overlooked Langer for the previous test. They'd gone with Simon Kadich, and Langer hadn't been opening for Australia. He'd be batting at three. So it's sort of he does get that big lucky break, and sort of in keeping with that theme in the chapter as well, you talk about your absurdly lucky break with the free for free advert that I'm sure a lot of people of my age who grew up in Australia would know. I don't even need to say anything more than that. Free for free, they know exactly what I'm saying. That HBA commercial that ran for seemingly years, where you have the speech impediment trying to seek some free health insurance at the time, which is a brilliant bit of television. But you're cast in that. I reckon that's probably the first time I saw you on telly. I mean, I might have before, but certainly that unexpectedly becomes a big break and gives you the freedom to spread your wings a little bit. You talk about a short film you made around a journalist having an affair with Ava Gardner during the making of On the Beach. I'd fucking love to see that. Talk about right in my zone. If you've got an edit of that some way, please send it through. I'm sure that's the sort of thing.
I actually was watching a bit of it. I came across a bit of it last night, bizarrely. It's so the Free for Free campaign didn't run in New South Wales and Queensland. So
really?
So you can Google it if you get a chance. It's HBA Free for Free, and I've got these buck teeth that were molded into my head, and I play a kind of a gormless guy. He can't say his THs, so he says free. So can I have free for free? And then he goes in and asks for the special, which is 3 months for free. Can I have free for free? And she goes, what? The receptionist says, what? And I say, can I have free for free? And she goes, oh, 3 for free. And she said, and I say, yeah, that's it. And she says, and I say, does that include optical? Because obviously it's meant to mean that, and she goes, yes, and dental, right? Yeah. And, fine, did the ad. And my mum, so it was 2001 when I actually did it, but it went on until 2005. But my mum had passed away, and I decided to take myself off on a holiday to Coolangatta. I'd never been on a holiday before, by myself. And I came back from Coolangatta because no one had seen the ad in Queensland. And I came back from Coolangatta, and I remember arriving at Melbourne Airport, and just people were just like just coming up to me from everywhere. They were just like, mobbing me almost. Oh, you're the free guy. It was the worst kind of fame. You were making the difference between Hemsworth fame and this fame. It was like they all thought they knew me, and I'd get these because my fucking phone number was my address was in the phone book because I didn't think I was going to become famous. And so I'd have these people turn up at the block of flats I was in, and the property manager helpfully told them, exactly what flat I was in. And, they would send cupcakes and notes and saying, I just want to care for you. And I just want to look after you. That was one bit of insanity. The other bit of insanity is just going for a jog and people chasing you down and just saying, and with their mobile phones out, here, speak to my wife. She's a big fan, It was a scary time. It was fun.
And kind of its time as well, right? Like that wouldn't probably happen. I don't reckon that would happen anymore. For what we talked about earlier around the communality of life. I mean, there wouldn't be a television commercial that you and I would go, oh, well, that's, we couldn't sing the fucking Mitre 10 song or something in a way that we would have 20 years ago, because people don't, it's not appointment viewing anymore. You stream your telly. So maybe you're...
Do you watch, who watches Free to Wear? I mean, looking at Free to Wear, it looks like it's programmed by a crack addict. It's just, it's like they're just so desperate. I can't imagine it being around in 5 years' time, really. I mean, I don't know what version of it will be around, but yeah, of course, no one knows what the ads are. But back then, if you did a kind of, it was more fame to be found in an ad than being like on Blue Heelers or something.
Right. Yeah. And I suppose that, you got in on the free to air television thing kind of maybe towards the end of its run with programs, as far as that gave you the platform for you. And you mentioned Jason Game before, but making the Wilfred, the initial iteration of Wilfred, which, kind of stems from a date of your own, which is a very funny story that you tell in the book. But well, I mean, the idea that you're on a date and there's this dog watching you.
Yeah, look, there was a girl who I'm very good friends with now, and she had a dog, a half Labrador, half dingo, and so we went back to her place. We're both Queenslanders, so we went back to her place after a Powderfinger concert, as you do, in Melbourne. And everything is going well. She's making a cup of tea in the kitchen, and I'm playing with the dog and throwing the dog the ball. The dog loves me. Then time to go to the bedroom, get on the bed, and the dog comes on the bed as well, and he's just like growling at me, and looking at me dead in the eye. And I'm thinking, are you gonna tell the dog to go away? I mean, is this going to be a bit weird? What's the rules there? And I was almost anthropomorphizing the dog at the time. I was like, him kind of going, what are you going to do to my missus? That kind of thing. And I was pretty uncomfortable. My mum had just passed, and I went, you know what, I'm going to go. And she went, yeah, okay. You're scared of the dog, are you? And Jason was staying at my house at the time, and so we'd always be improvising things. And I said, you be the dog and I'll be me. And so we did that for about 5 minutes, and I went, this is a short film. And so we wrote the short film, and then it did well, went to Trop Fest. And then I decided to try and make it into a series. And that went, we tried for 3 to 5 years trying to get it up. I think it was 2006. So when we actually sold the show to SBS in 2006, we shot the short film, and then we shot a pilot, which was another 20 minutes. And then in 2006, we then shot the final 3 or 4 minutes of that episode 1. All right. And so episode 1 is actually filmed over 6 years.
Right.
And my hairline through that time had got way further up my head. And so they had to put what they call triangles on my head to make it look like I had a lower hairline. And I talk about in the book. One day, let's just say one of those triangles went missing, and it caused a massive incident. But at the time, I was also getting word that, and this isn't in the book, that a lot of the cricketers were watching Wilfred. Not Ricky Ponting, who looks most like Wilfred, but Flem and all those guys were watching it. And that was probably one of my proudest moments. The idea that, that they were talking in the Inner Sanctum, they were talking about a show that I was involved in.
We've touched a couple of times on when things start to go well for you get a break in something or another, that there's something that kind of counterbalances it in your personal life. And so it is. You mentioned your mum passing away tragically at the age of 60. And of course, it's coming to an extent, but nevertheless.
Yeah.
I read something you wrote about grief earlier in the year when your dad died, and sort of the guilt and the pain of going on with life and then kind of reliving their last moments. And I mean, it's heavy stuff, of course. I know we're kind of bouncing back between light and shaky ourselves.
We put a lot of onus on, I think, on last moments. So that's the conclusion I've come to, is like, like, for instance, I wasn't I left to get lunch when my dad died. And then there's that residue guilt of, like, I wasn't there. I wasn't there. And then, that really is intense for the next 3 or 4 weeks. And then you start to actually kind of get a hold of yourself, and you see your relationship over a period of how many, your whole life, as opposed to the last 5 or 10 minutes that but mum dying in 2001, that was a big thing for me. And, but I feel, I don't, everyone's got their own idea of spirituality and everything, but I will say this: my life significantly improved when she'd passed, in the sense that it was almost like her spirit took a look at the state of my life, which was terrible. My flat, my working conditions, everything. Like, I suddenly got Wilfred was made. I was in that ad. I left the Herald Sun. I got a girlfriend who wasn't accusing me of stealing cars. It was, things like it was as though her spirit took one look at my life and thought, no, there's some work that needs to be done here.
I wonder whether there's something in that with how you met your eventual wife, Amanda, that you were ready to meet someone, and Wilfred's playing at a film festival, and not too dissimilar to the story you tell in the book about your mum and dad meeting, and it's kind of star-crossed lovers stuff, and their romance is quite a brisk one. They're quite sure quite quickly that you and Amanda, with you two, it was about, she knew cricket, she knew it properly, mate. And you were away. Yeah,
she's a few years older than me, but she was able to name the batting order of like 80-81 Australian Test team. I mean, she reckons she can't do it now, but I think she got down to Yardley, and that was when I remember thinking, I'll probably end up marrying you.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's nice that having that that cricket woven the whole way through. 05, you've already sort of talked about the Karma bus hitting Australia. Again, a detail I didn't know was in the dressing room at Lord's. That they went and sang the team song in England's dressing room after winning the first Test match. That's one of my favourite Test matches ever, having been at Lord's that week and told the story on the show before about paying a scalp a better part of 400 quid to get in.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So I've got this my own week at the cricket, which is the story I like to think and hold dear. But the story of the team, I missed the detail of them. Of them being, like literally going into the England dressing room to sing the song. Little did they know how badly that would backfire in the weeks to come.
I don't know if it's come across, but I'm an intensely superstitious person.
Yes.
All right. So the idea, I believe, I believe it was Langer's fault because he'd played for, what is it, Sussex? What's the home?
He was sorry, he played at Lord's Middlesex, yeah.
Middlesex, sorry.
Yeah.
And so he knew that how to get into the dressing room, the England dressing room, and so they waited until they left, and then they walked in. It was kind of like, okay, so they walked into the England dressing room and they sang the team song, and it was that very much that like the cat that's like rubbing its scent on its on it like marking its territory kind of behavior. And I remember thinking at the time, if you want to piss off a bunch of kind of, spirits, the guardians of cricket, you don't do it at Lord's, And after that, just the madness that happened in the next test with McGrath stepping on the ball and Ponting decided to bowl first. I mean, it was as though we were cursed, and that kind of played out.
The way you sort of end the cricket side of the book is sort of, 0607. It's the final cricketing chapter, if you like. You've had this success with Wilfred. It's really flying. Your relationship with celebrities continues. That you end up sort of mates with Geoffrey Rush and writing for him, and you're winning awards, and the show's going beautifully. You get a chance to kind of engage with cricket in your professional life as well through that recreation of Bodyline. In the lead up to that, though, I'm interested in sort of something you've written subsequently, but also the Jason says to you when it can kind of go either way with Wilfred. Yeah, it's probably going to be okay, but you just don't know for sure. And you kind of make the decision you're at Last Chance Saloon. And he says, I love you, mate, but I hate us. And it reminded me of something you've written about the sadness of adult friendships dying, not by choice necessarily, but when they can drift and fade away. This is an area you've written about independently of the book, but again, something that I think we can all relate to, can't we? That you just can't sustain the number of friendships you've got when you're 20 as when you're 40 or whatever it is. And thus there is this sort of sense of loss with people who you probably won't be friends with again. And that could have happened to you and Jason had Wilfred not quite got there at the time. I mean, maybe you would have remained friends, but that professional relationship probably needed to break up, if not for that final last-ditch effort with SBS.
Well, look, I think... You see, it was Jason and I mean, we met when we were 18 and we went to uni together. We put on a bunch of plays together. We made a bunch of short films. We did 52 episodes of sketch comedy, a feature film, and 2 seasons of Wilfred, right? But even before Wilfred, even before Wilfred actually got on television, but after the short film and everything, like, we spent enough time together for one life. All right, we both realized that, and I just like, it was kind of, we just knew everything about each other, and so I wanted to put that in because I didn't want to get into the nitty gritty of our relationship too much, and because I don't know if anyone's interested, and it's also just told from my perspective. But I just wanted to say that because it's such a great line. I love you because of everything that we've been through together, but I hate us. It's like, I'm just sick the sight of us. And, it was, it is interesting how, and what I was referring to in that article when adult friendships break up, is that, in your 20s, it's a punch on or a screaming match or whatever. And Jason and I had plenty of those. But when you're in your 40s, you might have a disagreement about something and find that they've unfollowed you on Twitter, and it's over. That's the only way it's over. And I just taking it back to cricket, I get very disturbed when I hear that 2 people don't get on in the team or something like that. That makes me quite sad. But of course, it's inevitable. I don't know what kind of fairyland I'm living in.
I'm much the same. My best mate has said to me over the years that one of my worst traits is that I want everybody else to be friends. Like I can't kind of handle when people don't get on, even though I can be caustic myself sometimes. It's that something about no. If I'm mates with you, then you should be mates with him as well. Yeah, we should come full circle here. And I find it difficult when that doesn't work out. And there's probably something in there around dressing rooms. You mentioned Dan Brettig before, who's a regular on this show, of course, and in his book Whitewash to Whitewash, which starts at the first chapter of it, the beginning of it is your kind of last chapter, if you like, the 0607 Ashes. The big running theme through that book is that the Australian cricket team, the Test team, or any Australian team, is a representative team. It's not a club team. You don't all grow up on the same patch of turf or share the same piece of carpet. You've been picked as representatives of those groupings and those states and those clubs and all the rest of it. So the need for people to get on to be successful isn't paramount. It's just, it's a happy accident when it does happen. It's coincidentally a good thing. And using your bit about I love you, but I hate us, I sort of saw some similarities in that with Damien Martin departure in 0607, which I think we wash over a bit. When we think about 0607, there's Amazing Adelaide, there's Warney and McGrath and Langer, but really Warney finishing up at the MCG, wicket 700, beating England 5-0 and doing it with a leg in the air seemingly, and that team kind of breaking up thereafter. But also that, Damien Martin probably loved all of those guys in the dressing room for all they'd been through, but he just couldn't do it anymore. And I think I have a better understanding of that in having that part of your discussion, that there reaches a point professionally and with friendships that you just have to let them go.
And he didn't want to tell Punter.
Yeah, his best mate of the life.
That's right. And I can understand that because, I'm a massive outsider. But to me, Ricky Ponting is someone you don't want to disappoint. I could imagine Marto just going, look, I tried to bring it up with him in South Africa and he didn't want to hear.
Right.
So the next time I do it, I'm going to have to do it in the dead of night and just and just send a fax, send an email to James Sutherland. And the fact that email was leaked was great for my book.
Yes.
And, but yeah, Marto was such a fascinating character. And thanks to Rob Linda, we see the majesty of his stroke play. Again, thanks to Rob Linda, we saw that clip the other night of him pushing away that Indian senator.
Yes, brilliant. When they win the Champions Trophy. If you haven't seen it yet, jump on Rob's Twitter from about 2 days ago when they're trying to get a bit too close to the Australian team and getting the photo when Ponting's holding up the trophy and Martin says, no, mate, fuck off.
That's right.
Pushes him off the stage.
Indian fans going, he was a very respected senator or whatever. And then Martin goes, don't care. Shouldn't have been in the photo.
So that's when that team starts to kind of, and I get this, by the way, how you go, look, that's the end of that part of your life as it relates to the Australian cricket team. You will still follow cricket. You obviously still follow it very closely and are invested in the results to an extent. But, the departure of 1,000 wickets out of the dressing room, how that corresponded with your youth, them retiring, you kind of putting it a little bit to one side and channeling that cricket interest into other projects. For example, your Bodyline project a few years ago, or longer than a few years ago, a while ago now, when you subjected yourself to Brett Lee bowling full tilt at you wearing the protective equipment of 1932-33, and you had this interest in Bodyline from when you were a kid, and the Hugo Weaving, Gary Sweet. I was going to call it a documentary. Far from a documentary. I wrote a university essay around the miniseries and went back and read all of Tiger O'Reilly's scathing assessments of the miniseries on account of just how inaccurate the whole movie had been. But, Kennedy Miller, absolute greats of, Australian film and all the rest of it. You just respect the art, right? And you got a chance to kind of have that life imitating art moment when Brett Lee bowled to you at 145 clicks like Larwood did to Australia 8 decades before.
Yeah. I mean, it was like, that was it's a documentary. We shot it over 2.5 years. I mean, it was just like the documentary that would never end. And the whole conceit was this kind of like Mythbusters thing where we were going to try and find out how fast Larwood was actually bowling, because of obviously no speedometers at the time. And we used 3D imaging to work it out. And because the one camera was like kind of at mid-off, like deep mid-off. And so they were able to like move the camera via 3D imaging, so it was adjacent to the wicket, and then of course measure Larwood's speed that way. And it was about 145, 147, only in that one over that they actually filmed. And you remember, he's a 5'7" guy. But he had these ridiculously long arms and that really rhythmic approach to the crease. And I was like fascinated from an early age, and I love that Kennedy Miller series, which if you look at now, it's just terrible. It's not aged well. But I've spoken a lot about it with Gary Sweet, who he was Richie Robinson. Richie Robinson was coaching him for 6 months, and so I've played a few charity matches with Gary Sweet, and he's handy. I do recall there's one charity match, and this is sorry, but you can cut this out. It was at the Peanut Farm in St Kilda, and Stephen Curry was bowling to Wayne Carey, and Wayne Carey hit him for 5 sixes in an over.
Of course he is.
A padless, boxless, gloveless, helmetless Wayne Carey hit Steve Curry. And then we had this other guy, because Richo was on our team, and we had this other guy who was like first change bowler, left armour, first change bowler for South Australia. And he was probably bowling about 135, 136. And clearly Carey should have gone back and put some pads on, or at least a fucking box. But no, he had to be the alpha. He just wouldn't. He was just wearing blow after blow from this guy, and still would just not go back and get pads. And that's all I remember, or gloves. So for me, we didn't know. Back to the documentary, I didn't know who was going to be the person who was going to be the Larwood. You know, obviously Brett Lee was the obvious choice. Because we needed someone who could bowl in the 140s to me, and McGrath wasn't able to get up there anymore. And the only other, Sean Tate, that would have been worrying because he's a slinger, so it's harder to know, where the ball's going. And if it was Mitchell Johnson, I reckon I wouldn't have been able to get away because I would have been cramped because it was left armour. Yeah. And I remember, the Mercedes pulling up, and for a second I thought it was Andy Bickle, because it was the blonde hair in the car. And I went, that's all right. It was Bickle. That's a little bit better. But no, Brett Lee got out. And it was before Phil Hughes' death. So, you wouldn't be able to get insurance for it now. And I wasn't wearing a helmet. And was a very average cricketer, as is displayed in the documentary. I was better than I was portrayed. I'm better than I was portrayed in the documentary, but I'm not good. They really fucked me over for the purposes of comedy. And so the point I'm making is that I don't see the ball until it's 3 meters in front of me. You're a worthy cricketer. You probably see it coming out of the bowler's hand. I don't. Your average guy does not see it until it's right in front of his face. And so I have no time to get away.
And no help by the fact that I watched it back before we did this interview. I remember watching it at the time, but I thought I'll watch this over back of you facing Brett Lee. People often say bowling off 19 yards. He was legitimately bowling off 19 yards. The side-on shots, he's bowling no balls by 4 feet, like he did to Piers Morgan, actually, at a similar time when they deployed Brett Lee for sort of... It's like they kind of, at the time, used to kind of wheel out the circus freak, right? Oh, let's get the guy that can kill someone and let him bowl at the unsuspecting, in your case, unpadded. Because but you did well, I think, getting inside the line and moving out the way. But you could, the tension and the build-up is clear. You're shitting yourself. Understandably,
mate, I got out to square leg point. I was fucking, yeah.
Better going that way though. It looks better going. I reckon it's better going out to point than going back to square leg in the situation like that. We're trying to get out the way.
I did think I had a lot of time to think about it, where I was going to go. I was going to go somewhere, and it wasn't going to be on the pitch.
No.
It was. I was very polite to him. He had a hangover. He'd been on a boat in Vanuatu for a week with some Australian fishermen, and who invited him just on their millionaire. One of them was a millionaire, had a boat, and invited Brett Lee on the boat. And I went, so did you know any of these people before you went on? And he goes, no, but you got to take that invitation. If someone invites you on a boat in Vanuatu, you got to take it, don't you? And I went, that is my worst nightmare, to be stuck on a boat with people I don't know for a whole week. But Brett Lee was fine.
Extraordinary that you were able to sort of face him the way that it played out. As we sort of get to the end of the book, there's this like lovely epilogue where you talk about where cricket fits for you today. I can identify with that with footy, actually, like the idea that my peak Hawthorn fandom has probably been and gone because I don't live in Australia, and you didn't live in Australia for a time either, living in the States and having that creative experience over there. But Tony Gregg's death had a big effect on you in the same way for me that Shane Warne's did, and others who played in that era would on me. I'm certain it would have been the case with Warne for you too, I'm sure, even though it's like an abstract thing of it's not about, who Shane Warne, every single iota, every single bit of his being. It was more that what he represented through my childhood, and I think we can all understand what that means. But at times, I suppose, in the last 15 years, the Australian team have been difficult to love, not least around the sandpaper debacle and all the rest of it. And you kind of get to this nice place at the end where you talk about always wanting to know the score, even though your life might take you a million miles away from cricket, your creative projects, whatever you're doing in your life. And that felt like a sort of a nice place to leave it, really. Like, you'll be an old man wanting to know what the score is. And I think I hope I'm that way too. I hope that even if my life takes me a long way from cricket, and in all probability it will at some stage, that I'm always curious enough to want to know what the score is.
Well, that I had a few friends whose fathers have died in the last 2 years, and they all seem to die after the summer had finished. The cricket's not on anymore,
right?
And it's like, it does mean a hell of a lot to us. And might I say, when I lived overseas for those 5 years, your podcast meant so much to me. The cricket meant so much to me. Just got like we lived in West Hollywood, and that extraordinary heading leanings by Stokes, which left me shattered. And I kind of want to go out into the street and just talk to someone about it. And they don't give a fuck about cricket.
Yeah.
Mind you, Chris O'Dowd lived next door, and I can't talk to him about it. I can't complain about Stokes to him. I mean, he's an Irishman anyway. He probably doesn't give a shit. But yeah, it was like you're listening to this bizarre thing. You're walking around West Hollywood and you're listening to them calling a test match, and it's such a strange clash of cultures.
Sort of in closing around that sort of when your book was published late last year and you did a lot of media around it and all the rest of it. Did your dad get a chance to read it before he passed away? Because obviously that takes place not long after.
Yeah, he did, and he loved it. And I was really worried because I described him at the start as being a bit of a Hemingway figure, smoking the cigars and drinking the red wine, and he was always getting into fights with people. And he was like, he's kind of, a hard-living Australian journalist. But then as he grew older, he kind of reinvented himself as this country gent. And it was very upstanding and everything. And so I didn't know how he'd respond to this, how I saw him, and but he loved it. So that was a huge relief. I mean, that would have been terrible because he died in April and the book came out in December. So it was, I actually wasn't going to send it to him. I was that worried about how he'd receive it, but he managed to, and also I was programming all his Kindle books into his Kindle. So I don't know how the hell he got hold of the book, but he did, because I didn't give it to him. And he goes, yeah, it was great. It's great. All the nurses have read it, and I went, oh, okay, thanks, Dad. And that was a big relief. So for him to have died and hated it, that would have been a big thing for me.
That is a nice place to sort of leave the book as well. I think that your dad is such a big part of what you've written about, and it's a ripper of a book. I can only commend it. I showed it to the wrong camera earlier. We'll show it to the right camera this time. It is called 12 Summers by Adam Zwar. You knew what you were getting into when speaking to us, so it's been an hour and 40 minutes or something like that. But as a listener to the podcast, we always go long, and that's kind of
thank you. It's a huge, as I said, you guys meant so much to me when I was in LA. And to be on it, it's a beautiful clash of worlds as opposed to the West, seeing kind of crazy naked people walking down the street at Melrose, because they do that. They're people in the nude, not beautiful people, and just listening to the Ashes as you're walking past those kind of people. That is a terrible clash of cultures. But this has been a great one, mate. So thanks for having me. And I hope you do more. I hope you do more greater season too, by the way.
Yeah, we will. Maybe that's something for the future. We can walk down West Hollywood with our cocks out listening to the cricket. Until such time, we'll see you again. Thanks for writing the book. Thanks for coming on and talking about it at length. And we'll catch up soon, I'm sure.
Thank you, mate.